on March 1st, 2026, drone strikes authorized by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) directly hit three Amazon Web Services AWS data centers in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. The resulting structural damage, fires, and water suppression failures critically impaired multiple cloud availability zones, wiping out services for major banks and tech platforms. This was not an accident. It was a targeted military strike on American corporate infrastructure. Following the attack, the IRGC released a kill list of 18 U.S. companies, explicitly threatening tech titans like Google, Microsoft, Apple, Meta, IBM, and Boeing with destruction starting April 1st. Employees were warned to evacuate immediately, and residents were told to clear a 1-kilometer radius around these corporate facilities. We are witnessing the first publicly confirmed military attack on a hyperscale cloud provider. American megacorporations are no longer just bystanders or defense contractors. They are active targets in a rapidly expanding war. The illusion that the digital economy is insulated from geopolitical violence has been shattered overnight. Welcome to the new era of global conflict, where the apps on your phone, the servers hosting your data, and the logistics of global supply chains are all in the crosshairs. If you think this war is confined to the Middle East, you are gravely mistaken. The threat to U.S. companies is immediate, existential, and expanding faster than the market can react. The geopolitical powder keg officially detonated on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. This coordinated military strike targeted Iranian military infrastructure, missile systems, naval assets, and nuclear-related sites across multiple locations. In immediate retaliation, Iran launched asymmetric operations, missile strikes, and drone swarms against Israeli territory, U.S. military installations, and indiscriminate commercial targets throughout the region. The situation has rapidly devolved into a multi-theater crisis. In the maritime domain, the Joint Maritime Information Center (JMIC) has assessed the regional threat environment as critical across the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, Arabian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz. Commercial transit through the Strait of Hormuz, a strategic choke point that normally handles 20% of global oil supply, has completely collapsed. Where historically 138 vessels transited daily, AIS data recorded days in March 2026, where tanker transits dropped to absolute zero. Iran has effectively initiated a selective, permission-based blockade. In March alone, oil loadings at ports west of Hormuz plummeted by a staggering 76%, dropping from 22.2 million barrels per day to just 5.28 million. The fallout from this blockade and the ensuing military confrontation is already sending shockwaves through the global economy. The Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee has warned that the U.S.-Israel war on Iran has dealt a substantial negative supply shock to the world economy. Financial market jitters have caused lenders to pull thousands of mortgage products, and the bank predicts that an additional 1.3 million UK households will face higher mortgage payments by the end of 2028 due to Trumpflation stemming from the conflict. Simultaneously, the US has opened another front in its own hemisphere. In the most assertive American action for regime change since 2003, US forces intervened in Venezuela, capturing deposed President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. While President Trump initially claimed the U.S. would run the country, Secretary of State Marco Rubio clarified that the U.S. would instead enforce an existing oil quarantine to press for policy changes. However, this stunning military operation has drawn sharp condemnation from Latin American and European allies, warning of a dangerous precedent. This is the reality of our current situation. The U.S. is engaged in kinetic conflicts in the Middle East and South America. Global shipping is choked, and Iran has explicitly declared war on the crown jewels of the American economy. Major banks, including HSBC and Citi, have already begun evacuating offices and closing branches in the Middle East. The war has arrived at the corporate doorstep, and the global economic foundation is trembling. We should have seen this coming. For years, defense analysts and cybersecurity experts have been sounding the alarm about the capability-vulnerability paradox. As our technological capabilities expanded, so did our risk of exploitation. The warning signs were written in the code of every major cyber attack over the past decade. Russian-backed hackers compromised SolarWinds in 2020, infiltrating U.S. government agencies, and crippled the Colonial Pipeline in 2021, exposing massive vulnerabilities in the U.S. energy sector. Meanwhile, Chinese state-sponsored groups like Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon systematically targeted U.S. critical infrastructure, defense sectors, and even presidential campaign communications. But the most glaring warning sign came from a group known as the Handala Hack Team. Operating as a front for the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence, MOIS, this hacktivist group began an aggressive campaign of cyber vigilantism in late 2023. Throughout 2024 and 2025, they systematically dismantled Israeli infrastructure, hacking the Iron Dome radar systems, seizing terabytes of data from the Sorek Nuclear Research Center, and breaching the Shin Bet security system. They leaked tens of thousands of emails from top political figures and extorted medical and technological companies. Then, in March 2026, Handala escalated from regional nuisance to global threat. In retaliation for the Iran war, they launched a devastating wiper attack against the Michigan-based medical technology manufacturer Stryker Corporation, which serves 150 million patients worldwide. The attack utilized Microsoft Intune to destroy over 200,000 systems and devices across 79 countries, severely disrupting global manufacturing and forcing tens of thousands of employees offline. This was recorded as the most significant wartime cyber attack on the United States in history. Even after the FBI seized their domains, Handala simply restored their infrastructure and responded by hacking the personal emails of the FBI director. Furthermore, independent threat researchers uncovered that these ransomware operations are operating at the scale of a global economy. When Huntress Labs investigated a routine brute force attack on an exposed RDP server, they unraveled a massive geo-distributed infrastructure network tied to ransomware as a service ecosystems. These threat actors are methodically mapping corporate vulnerabilities. The warning signs were flashing red. Adversaries were no longer just seeking to steal data. They were building the capability to shut down American corporate infrastructure at will. The fact that Amazon's cloud facilities were physically struck by drones is merely the kinetic evolution of a cyber campaign that has been openly waged against U.S. companies for years. The rules of engagement have fundamentally shifted. Historically, civilian infrastructure was largely protected during armed conflict, but the digitalization of modern society has blurred the line between combatant and civilian. According to a landmark 2025 report by the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and the Geneva Academy, the attack surface in modern conflict has vastly increased because civilians and militaries now rely on the exact same digital infrastructure. When a private technology company provides digital services, data management, or cybersecurity to a party in an armed conflict, its physical and digital assets risk becoming legitimate military objectives. This is precisely the legal and strategic justification Iran used for the AWS drone strikes. Iranian state media explicitly claimed the data centers were legitimate targets because the U.S. military uses AI systems, such as Anthropic's Claude, hosted on AWS for intelligence analysis and war simulations. Under international law, an object becomes a military objective if its nature, location, purpose, or use makes an effective contribution to military action and its destruction offers a definite military advantage. Because hyperscale data centers host dual-use infrastructure and defense workloads alongside civilian commercial applications, they have inadvertently painted a massive target on their own backs. This is not without historical precedent. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, U.S. naval forces deliberately severed submarine telegraph cables operated by a British company because the cables carried Spanish military communications. In the resulting Cuba Submarine Telegraph Company v. and campaign, United States arbitration of 1923, The tribunal ruled that private property rights are overridden by legitimate acts of war without obligation for compensation. Today, the cloud has become the modern telegraph cable. This battlefield shift is severely exacerbated by the data localization trap. In recent years, Gulf states and other nations have mandated that sensitive public sector and government data be physically hosted within their borders to ensure digital sovereignty. To compete for these lucrative government and defense contracts, hyperscalers like Microsoft, Google, and Oracle were forced to build massive physical data centers in the Middle East. By intertwining civilian enterprise data with sovereign government workloads in localized server farms, tech companies inadvertently elevated their facilities to high-value military targets sitting in an active war zone. Furthermore, corporate legal protections are evaporating. Tech companies typically rely on force majeure clauses to avoid liability when services are disrupted by war. However, regional courts in the Middle East, particularly the Dubai Court of Cassation, have established strict jurisprudence. Entering a contract in a region with known geopolitical volatility means military disruptions are a foreseeable operational risk. Because providing a contracted service is an obligation of result, tech providers disabled by strikes will be legally required to absorb upstream sunk costs and refund clients entirely, facing massive financial liabilities with no recourse against the state attackers. Why are companies like Apple, Meta, Google, Tesla, and Nvidia on a military kill list? Because the traditional defense industrial base is no longer the sole purveyor of military superiority. Today, commercial tech companies develop the artificial intelligence, advanced computing, cloud infrastructure, and geospatial analytics that power modern warfare. The IRGC's statement was chillingly clear. Since the main element in designing and tracking assassination targets are American ICT and AI companies, the main institutions involved in terrorist operations will be considered legitimate targets. The U.S. military's strategic doctrine of integrated deterrence relies heavily on cross-domain coordination powered by AI, machine learning, and advanced cloud computing. Tools like predictive analytics and large language models are actively used by the military to process radio chatter, monitor troop movements, and accelerate the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act (ODA) loop. Because U.S. technology companies build and host these precise capabilities, they are indistinguishable from defense contractors in the eyes of U.S. adversaries. This corporate vulnerability extends far beyond the Middle East. The greatest systemic risk to U.S. tech companies lies in the Indo-Pacific, specifically regarding Taiwan. Taiwan manufactures over 60% of the world's semiconductors and more than 90% of the most advanced chips, which are the lifeblood of Apple, Nvidia, and the entire U.S. tech sector. A Chinese military blockade or invasion of Taiwan would instantly sever access to the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. The economic impact to the United States from the destruction of Taiwan's tech ecosystem is conservatively estimated at $2 trillion. If China seizes Taiwan, the CCP would acquire a massive choke point over the global economy, mirroring their dominance in rare earth elements. U.S. companies are critically dependent on these foreign nodes. While the U.S. is attempting to onshore chip manufacturing, true resilience is still years away. Therefore, adversaries recognize that striking U.S. companies, either physically in the Middle East or economically by threatening the Asian semiconductor supply chain, is the most effective way to cripple American power projection. Companies are the target because they are the engine of American hegemony. The global economic ramifications of this expanding war are staggering. S&P Global Ratings estimates that global sovereign long-term borrowing will reach $14.10 trillion in 2026, a 5% increase from 2025 and double the rate from 2019. This massive debt load is being exacerbated by the Middle East conflict, which S&P warns will have long-lasting effects on commodities and financing conditions, global supply chains, and macro credit conditions. The maritime crisis is strangling international trade. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed to commercial transit, energy markets are highly volatile. In the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, the threat remains critical as Houthi forces continue utilizing anti-ship ballistic missiles, drones, and unmanned surface vessels to target commercial shipping. The disruption is so severe that maritime insurers are expanding their listed areas and raising additional premiums, making voyage costs exorbitant. For the tech sector, the drone strikes on AWS have triggered a panic. Many global enterprises had no idea their cloud workloads were being routed through the Middle East until the regional outages took down their payment platforms, data clouds, and banking services. As a result, businesses are abandoning single-region cloud deployments. Ironically, this physical vulnerability is driving up cloud revenues as companies are forced to purchase expensive multi-region disaster recovery and premium resilience services. However, the cost of securing this infrastructure is astronomical. Standard commercial property and business interruption insurance policies explicitly exclude acts of war. Tech companies are now scrambling to secure specialized war risk policies, which are complex and heavily contested by underwriters. Furthermore, the logistics of data migration are paralyzed, moving workloads out of a structurally damaged facility in a conflict zone while complying with local data residency laws is practically impossible. On Main Street, the impact is already hitting consumers. The Bank of England's warning about Trumpflation is a harbinger of global stagflation. As energy costs fluctuate and supply chains break down, everyday citizens will bear the brunt of the geopolitical crisis through higher interest rates, increased mortgage payments, and soaring inflation. The U.S. intervention in Venezuela adds another layer of market instability, although ironically, Venezuela's degraded oil infrastructure means Trump's plan to seize and revitalize the sector won't offer immediate relief to global oil prices. We are staring down the barrel of a global multi-front conflict. The strategic convergence of the PRC, Russia, Iran, and North Korea presents an unprecedented challenge to U.S. deterrence. These revisionist powers are actively sharing military technologies, collaborating on AI, and conducting joint operations to erode U.S. dominance. Iran's kinetic attacks on U.S. tech companies are a test of American resolve, and the escalation risks are terrifying. If the U.S. retaliates heavily against Iran, Tehran could easily unleash its proxy network to launch further catastrophic attacks on civilian and corporate infrastructure. The Council on Foreign Relations lists a highly disruptive, AI-enabled cyber attack on U.S. critical infrastructure as a Tier 1, high-impact risk for 2026. State-sponsored hackers could target the U.S. energy grid, water supplies, or financial networks, bringing the war directly to the American homeland. Simultaneously, the U.S. military is dangerously stretched. Trump's intervention in Venezuela has removed Maduro, but the U.S. now faces the daunting task of managing an unstable South American nation while fighting a hot war in the Middle East. This creates a dangerous window of opportunity in the Indo-Pacific. With U.S. attention divided, China might calculate that now is the perfect time to escalate its military, economic, and political pressure on Taiwan. China has already mastered gray zone coercion, actions below the threshold of armed conflict, such as daily airspace incursions and maritime harassment. As noted by defense experts, ignoring this gray zone campaign is destabilizing because it teaches Beijing that coercion works. If China believes the U.S. is too bogged down in the Middle East and Venezuela to respond, this gray zone pressure could rapidly turn black and white. An armed confrontation involving China, the U.S., and allies over Taiwan or the South China Sea would trigger a global economic depression and risk nuclear escalation. The militarization of commercial technology will also inevitably expand into space. The U.S. FCC has approved thousands of Starlink satellites, while China plans massive constellations of its own. As these commercial networks increasingly support military logistics and communications, they will become prime targets for anti-satellite weapons and electronic warfare. The escalation risk is no longer confined to Earth, it stretches into low Earth orbit. The era of strategic ambiguity is dead. The United States and its corporate giants can no longer pretend that global commerce operates in a vacuum separate from geopolitical realities. To protect its vital national interests, the U.S. must adopt a policy of strategic clarity, leaving no doubt about its willingness and capability to defend its assets and allies. For the U.S. government, this requires fully operationalizing integrated deterrence, seamlessly combining military, cyber, diplomatic, and economic power. The U.S. must counter China's gray zone coercion by explicitly linking Chinese aggression against Taiwan to punitive U.S. actions, such as deploying advanced missile systems to the region or levying crushing sanctions. Furthermore, the U.S. must build a robust coalition of like-minded nations to oppose authoritarian coercion and raise the costs of aggression. For U.S. companies, the next move requires a total paradigm shift in risk management. The procurement teams evaluating data center locations can no longer just look at power grid stability and tax incentives. They must heavily prioritize the geopolitical threat vectors, the defensive posture of the host nation, and the dual-use nature of co-tenants. Overhaul disaster recovery, rewrite insurance and contracts, and enhance cyber-physical security are no longer optional. They are existential imperatives. The strikes on AWS and the IRGC's kill list are not anomalies. They are the new standard operating procedure. Commercial infrastructure is now a permanent fixture on the battlefield. U.S. companies are under threat, the war is expanding, and survival depends on recognizing that in the modern world, every corporation is on the front lines.